Distress signal confirmed. Origin locked.
Threat level is rising. Mobilize teams.
Drones are in the air. Keep the channel open.
Acknowledged.
The operations center was built to mute humanity. Fluorescent ceiling panels stretched in perfect geometric repetition. A grid of pale light that flattened every face beneath it. The air carried the metallic chill of overworked ventilation. Polished floors reflected the light in sterile streaks, as though the room had been scrubbed not only of dust, but of hesitation, doubt, and consequence. Screens lined, the far wall silent, luminous, disciplined. At 2:17. The red indicator began to blink. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a steady, clinical pulse against the matte black console. SOS. The sound that accompanied it was thinner than it should have been. A thread of static, a fractured voice pressing through interference. Viper Recon taking, grid repeat taking. The transmission snapped, returned, snapped again. Around the long central table, officers remained upright, their backs straight enough to seem architectural. Their uniforms were pressed into submission. Their ID badges rested flat against their chests, small rectangles of authorization catching the fluorescent light. They did not move toward the console. They turned instead to one another. The blinking red light reflected in their eyes. Signal integrity? Someone asked, voice measured. Degraded? The communications officer replied. Terrain interference. No one said what it was. A call for help. The static filled the room more honestly than any human voice. At the far end of the table, seated slightly apart, she watched. Her posture was exact, but not rigid. One boot rested slightly behind the other. Anchored her ID badge, hung unpolished. Its surface scratched at the edges, from years of field contact. It caught less light than the others. She did not adjust it. The red indicator blinked again. SOS. Viper Recon was cleared for reconnaissance only, a senior officer said. His tone was neutral, as though reading weather data. They exceeded their perimeter. Exceeded. As if curiosity were a crime. The screens shifted. A satellite image of arid terrain appeared jagged, ridgelines pale and indifferent. A blue icon marked Viper Recon's last confirmed position. Around it, smaller red pings began to populate the map. Encirclement. The blinking red light continued, its steady rhythm. The institution did not see men pinned under hostile fire. It saw a deviation from operational parameters. A complication? A line item? Closest rapid response unit? Another officer asked. 43 minutes out, came the reply. Silence followed, heavy but not surprised. 40-3 minutes was a calculation, not a sentence. It assumed endurance. It assumed expendability. Static flared again. We are compromised. Request immediate. The voice cut out mid-breath. The fluorescent lights hummed. The hum was constant, impartial. It did not rise to meet urgency. It did not dim in sympathy. She felt the weight of the room's stillness more than the content of the transmission. The officer's shoulders remained squared. Hands rested flat on the table, fingers neither clenched nor trembling. Their discipline was impeccable. Their hesitation was deliberate. Authorization for close air. Someone suggested. A pause. Papers shifted. A pen tapped once against lacquered wood. Negative, the senior officer replied. Collateral risk. Collateral risk. The phrase landed cleanly, like a stamp. The red light blinked. SOS. She leaned forward slightly, just enough for her chair to whisper against the polished floor. No one looked at her at first. She was not in the direct chain of command. She occupied the perimeter of the room, the way a shadow occupies the edge of a wall present. Unacknowledged, structurally inconvenient. Her voice, when it came, did not rise. I can take Overwatch. The words did not echo. They entered the air and settled there. Several heads turned, not sharply, not angrily, just enough to register the breach in expected silence. The senior officer regarded her as one might regard an unexpected variable in a controlled experiment. You're not on rapid deployment rotation, he said. No, she agreed. Static crackled again, louder, this time. A burst of gunfire bled through the transmission before dissolving into white noise. The red light blinked faster for a moment, as if agitated by its own persistence. I can be wheeled up in 6, she said. 6 minutes was not 43. The officers exchanged glances that were too brief to be called consultation, but too loaded to be casual. Their ID badges shifted against their chests as they turned. Small metallic clicks, punctuating the silence. Rules of engagement are clear, someone said carefully. Recon teams assume calculated risk. Calculated by whom? The silence asked. Did not argue. She did not plead. Her hands rested loosely on the table's edge, fingers steady. She had learned long ago that volume was mistaken for volatility. Below them, on the satellite image, the blue icon flickered. Encircled. The room returned to its hum. The fluorescent panels above cast no shadows, deep enough to hide in. Everything was visible. Everything was exposed, except accountability. If they're lost, another officer said, voice lowered, the inquiry will scrutinize response time. There it was. Not the lives. The inquiry. The red light blinked again. SOS. The senior officer exhaled through his nose. A small sound, almost administrative. You understand? He said to her. This would be a deviation from protocol. If escalation occurs, it won't, she said. It was not bravado. It was assessment. A long pause followed. In it lived the entire architecture of the institution: risk matrices, liability forecasts, reputational calculus. The silence pressed against the glass walls of the operations center and found them unyielding. Finally, the senior officer nodded. Once. Verbal authorization granted, he said. You will operate independently. Report engagement. Verbal, not written. The red light continued to blink, as if it had not heard. She rose. Her chair slid back with a soft, controlled scrape. Her ID badge swung once against her uniform before settling flat again. She did not smooth it. 6 minutes, she said. No one responded. As she moved toward the exit, the polished floor carried her reflection in fractured lines of light. The fluorescent panels above remained unchanged, humming in sterile continuity. Behind her, the officers resumed their positions, backs straight, hands composed, eyes on screens. The blinking red indicator persisted. SOS. In the operations center, it was not a cry. It was a veritable, of risk to be managed, a narrative to be contained. And as the door sealed shut behind her with a soft hydraulic sigh, the room did what institutions do best. It stabilized. The light blinked on, and on, and on. Far from the polished floors and fluorescent ceilings, men waited in dust and gunfire. Here, beneath controlled light, the greater battle was not against an enemy on the RIDGELINE. It was against the reflex to do nothing unless doing something protected the system. First, the aircraft smelled of oil and recycled air, but it was not sterile. Its metal ribs were exposed. Its interior rattled with each shift in altitude. The hum here was mechanical, not bureaucratic. It did not pretend to be neutral. It emitted strain. She sat alone along the fuselage, boots braced against the vibrating floor, rifle case secured between her knees. The red webbing of her harness cut a diagonal line across her chest, pressing her ID badge flat against the fabric of her uniform. Even here, it remained visible. Authorization did not loosen with altitude. The fluorescent lights of the operations center had been replaced by a narrow strip of yellow cabin bulbs, flickering faintly with turbulence. Beyond the open rear ramp, night air roared, dry, immense, indifferent. She did not close her eyes. The systemic weight had followed her into the sky, not in words, not in reprimands, in memory. A briefing room, months earlier, wood-paneled, climate-controlled, polite, her assessment of wind patterns dismissed, then restated by a male lieutenant and accepted without friction. Raised eyebrows when she requested long-range overwatch instead of secondary support. A pause before her name. A longer pause before her rank. Are you comfortable at that distance? Someone had once asked. She had nodded. Comfort was irrelevant. The aircraft banked. Below, the terrain revealed itself in fragments. Pale ridgelines, fractured valleys, long scars of dry riverbeds. No fluorescent panels here. No polished floors. Only dust and gravity. When the aircraft touched down, in a controlled skid of sand and rotor wash, the world expanded instantly. Heat pressed against her face as she stepped onto open ground. Her boots sank slightly, the sand except in weight. Without judgment, it did not question her placement. It did not measure her deviation from rotation. Dust lifted in spirals around the landing zone, then settled slowly over metal surfaces, over the aircraft's tail, over her rifle case, over the polished barrel within. Dust did not discriminate. She moved away from the aircraft without looking back. The noise receded behind her, replaced by wind cutting across exposed terrain. Somewhere beyond the ridgeline ahead, gunfire echoed in irregular bursts. Not rhythmic, not disciplined, desperate, nerd. Her boots left deliberate impressions in the sand as she advanced toward higher ground. Each step was measured, neither hurried nor slow. The sky above was vast and mercilessly clear. It held no ceiling panels, no humming lights, only distance. The radio clipped to her shoulder crackled. Viper position compromised multiple. Hostiles north and east. Static swallowed the rest. She did not respond. Speech here would not alter geometry. She reached the base of a rocky incline and began to climb. The rifle case secured across her back. Pebbles shifted underfoot. Heat radiated from stone. The battlefield announced itself not with spectacle, but with pressure, invisible lines converging toward a single trapped unit below. When she reached the crest, She lowered herself into prone position without ceremony. The ground was uneven, abrasive against her forearms. Sand crept into the seams of her gloves. She opened the rifle case. Inside, the metal gleamed with restrained precision. Even under open sky, it retained a faint memory of polish, a reflection of fluorescent light, embedded in its finish. Dust drifted down and settled along the barrel. She did not brush it away immediately. Instead, she assembled the rifle piece by deliberate piece. Bolt seated, bipod extended. Scope mounted with practiced alignment. Each motion economical. Each click final. The rifle scope was circular, its glass dark until lifted. It contained horizon. She pressed her eye to it, and the world contracted. The chaos below reorganized into lines and vectors. The circular frame erased the periphery and elevated the essential. Viper Recon's position became visible. 4 figures pinned behind fractured stone, movements sharp and defensive. Beyond them, hostile fighters shifted between cover points, advancing incrementally. Through the scope, there were no raised eyebrows, no procedural disclaimers, no hesitation disguised as prudence, only sight. She adjusted for wind. The crosshairs drifted slightly, then stilled. A slow exhale below. One member of Viper Recon attempted to reposition. Gunfire erupted in response, forcing him back behind cover. The sound reached her a half-second later, flattened by distance. Her radio crackled again. Any support? Respond. The transmission dissolved. Silence pressed against her ear. She did not answer. Her silence was not absence. It was concentration. The first hostile stepped into partial view. Exposed shoulder. Weapon raised. Attention fixed downward toward the trapped team. He did not look up. Few ever did. Through the circular lens, he occupied the center of her vision. Outside that circle, the world did not exist. She adjusted to clicks left. One down. Breath in. Breath held. The trigger broke cleanly. Was controlled, intimate. It contained violence. The sound of the shot traveled across the valley a moment later, indistinguishable at first from the surrounding gunfire. Through the scope, the hostile fell without spectacle. No dramatic arc, no cinematic collapse, just a body losing vertical integrity. The imbalance shifted. Below, Viper Recon hesitated, then seized the opening to reposition. One moved to a new angle of cover. Another returned fire with renewed precision. She chambered the next round. No triumph rose in her chest. No surge of vindication. Only recalibration. A second hostile attempted to flank from the eastern ridge. She tracked the movement smoothly, the circular frame narrowing in tension into inevitability. Another breath. Another correction. Another shot. Dust lifted where the body met ground. The battlefield began to reorganize itself around absence. Over the radio, a strained voice broke through the static. Overwatch, is that you? She did not answer. She adjusted elevation. The scope's circular boundary held steady, defining who remained visible and who would vanish. The institution back in the operations center had its own lens. Risk reports, authorization, hierarchies, verbal disclaimers. It too selected what to see. Here. Selection meant survival. A third hostile ducked behind cover, too slowly. She fired below. Viper Recon's formation shifted from defensive crouch to coordinated advance. They did not know her position. They did not need it. They felt the correction. Wind crossed the ridge, tugging at her sleeve. Dust continued to settle over polished metal, dulling shine into function. Boots in sand, breath in lungs. Static in the radio. She remained prone, unmoving, except for the disciplined mechanics of engagement. The scope framed the battlefield as a series of moral decisions rendered in seconds. Not emotional, not impulsive. Necessary. Far below, the last hostile broke from cover and ran, abandoning position. She tracked him for a moment, finger resting against the trigger. Then she lowered the rifle slightly. The circle of the scope widened as her eye pulled back. The world returned to its full, unfiltered expanse. Viper Recon stood alive in the open sky. There were no fluorescent panels to hum approval. No polished floors to reflect commendation. Only wind crossing a newly quiet ridge. The battlefield had been structured long before her arrival by command decisions, by delayed authorization, by the assumption that 43 minutes was acceptable. She had not altered the structure. She had corrected its most immediate failure. And as dust settled over rifle metal once more, the valley below looked less like a site of heroism and more like a ledger. Losses narrowly avoided. Not because the system functioned as designed, but because someone within it refused to look away. The valley did not fall silent all at once. It thinned. Gunfire, once chaotic and overlapping, began to space itself into isolated cracks that echoed against stone before dissolving into open air. Dust hung low across the terrain, veiling the jagged edges of rock formations and turning movement into suggestion rather than certainty. She remained prone along the ridge, body aligned behind the rifle as though molded to it. The steady reticle hovered within the circular field of the scope, unblinking, centered, patient. Below, Viper Recon had not yet understood the pattern. Inside their fractured cover position, fear was physical. It constricted the lungs. It narrowed peripheral vision into tunneled survival. One of them pressed his back against stone, worn smooth by centuries of wind, counting rounds without realizing he was counting. Another adjusted a tourniquet on his own thigh with hands that trembled not from pain, but from anticipation of the next volley. They did not know where the next shot would come from. They only knew it would. A round struck the rock above them, scattering fragments like sparks. Instinct forced them lower, closer to the ground, into the thin shade cast by broken stone. Sweat mixed with dust on their faces, turning skin into grit. Then a shot echoed from higher ground. Not theirs. A hostile advancing from the northern flank jerked sideways and fell, weapon dislodging from his grip. For a moment, no one moved. Not even the wind seemed willing to claim the body. Through the scope, she did not observe the fallen man. She observed the space he no longer occupied. The reticles shifted left, calculated. Smoothed another hostile attempted to adjust, shouting commands that carried faintly up the ridge. His posture changed, more cautious now, more compressed. He scanned the terrain but kept his attention level, focused on the pinned team. He did not look up. She exhaled. The trigger broke. He collapsed. Mid-instruction voice severed in the throat of command. Below, one member of Viper Recon dared to lift his head above cover for a fraction longer than before. His eyes scanned the ridgeline, and for a brief second, aligned with her position, he could not see her face. Only the flash of controlled fire. The radio crackled at her shoulder. A voice, raw and disbelieving, cut through static. "We see." Its words carried more than acknowledgement. They carried relief, edged with caution, as if naming her presence might cause it to vanish. She did not answer. Silence, here, was not absence of solidarity. It was refusal to dilute action. With reassurance, another hostile fired blindly toward the ridge. The round struck stone several meters from her position, chipping rock into fine powder that drifted across her sleeve. She did not flinch. The steady reticle held. The third shot landed cleanly. Below, the geometry shifted again. Viper Recon moved with renewed precision, not emboldened, but recalibrated. They advanced by inches, reclaiming fragments of terrain that minutes earlier had seemed permanently lost. One dragged a wounded teammate to deeper cover, while another laid suppressive fire toward a narrowing arc of resistance. Empty shell casings accumulated near her right hand, small brass cylinders catching brief flashes of sunlight before settling into dust. They formed no pattern. They marked no ceremony. They simply existed as evidence. Wind crossed the ridge, carrying the faint scent of spent gunpowder upward. It pressed against her cheek and tugged lightly at the fabric of her uniform. The world beyond the scope remained vast and indifferent, but within the circular frame everything was immediate. Another hostile broke from concealment, attempting retreat along a dry wash that cut through the valley floor. She tracked him without haste. In the scope, he became smaller with each stride, but clarity did not diminish. Distance sharpened judgment. Rather than blurring it, breath in. Pause. Correction. The shot echoed longer this time, bouncing between ridgelines before dissolving into the open sky. He fell forward, momentum carrying him into dust. Silence followed. Not absolute, but altered. Below, Viper Recon ceased firing one by one, as if testing whether the quiet would hold. One soldier rose to a crouch, scanning the perimeter with disbelief that bordered on suspicion. "Area's clear," someone muttered over there. "Internal comes." Not a declaration, a question. She kept the reticle steady, sweeping the terrain. In slow arcs, circle framed empty rock, abandoned weapons, bodies unmoving in sand. No further movement registered. The radio crackled again. "Overwatch," the same voice said. "Steadier now. We owe you." CI shifted the safety into place. Her silence answered. Power did not require articulation. It required precision. Below, Viper Recon emerged fully from cover. Their movements were cautious but upright. Juan removed his helmet briefly, running a hand through sweat-matted hair before replacing it. Another knelt beside a fallen hostile, confirming absence of threat with professional detachment. There was no cheer, no raised weapon in triumph. Only, breathing, she lifted her eye from the scope. The circular frame dissolved, and the world returned in its full dimension. Harsh sunlight, jagged terrain, wind carving, invisible lines across open ground. The rifle lay warm beneath their hands. Dust had settled along its barrel, softening its earlier polish into muted gray. At her wrist, the small device that had pulsed insistently since departure continued its rhythm. Blink, blink, blink. Sos, she pressed a single button. The blinkins stopped. The absence of red light felt heavier than its presence. The wind intensified momentarily, sweeping across the ridge and down into the valley, lifting thin veils of sand that drifted across the bodies below. It did not distinguish between the living and the dead. It erased footprints with equal indifference. She began disassembling the rifle with the same deliberate care with which she had assembled it. Scope detached. Bolt cleared. Each motion unhurried. Each click contained. Empty shell casings remained in the sand. Evidence of correction. Below, Viper Recon signaled extraction coordinates. Their voices had steadied into procedural clarity. As though the ordeal had already begun to compress into after-action language: contact neutralized, casualties minimal, mission salvageable. Language would reshape what had happened. It would compress fear into bullet points and convert seconds into statistics. The battlefield, now quiet, bore no visible trace of hesitation from a distant operations center. It did not record the 43-minute calculation. It did not display the raised eyebrows or the pause before authorization. But the clearing was not triumph. It was exposure. The system had failed before the first shot was fired, failed in its delay, in its calculus, in its instinct to protect procedure over people. Her rifle had not altered that architecture. It had only intervened in its consequence. As she rose, from the ridge, slinging the rifle across her back, the valley below seemed smaller than before, contained, manageable. From a distance, it could almost be mistaken for order restored. But wind moved across exposed terrain, without regard for narrative. It carried dust over bodies and over boots alike. It whispered through rock formations that would remain long after commendations were drafted and filed. The steady reticle had cleared the field. The indictment remained. The hearing chamber was colder than the battlefield, not in temperature, but in intention. Polished wood lined the walls from floor to ceiling, dark and immaculate, absorbing sound rather than echoing it. Recessed lighting cast controlled pools of illumination downward, leaving the upper corners of the room in deliberate shadow. Nothing here was accidental. Every angle had been measured. Every line had purpose. At the center stretched a long wooden table, its surface lacquered to a muted sheen. It divided the room with quiet authority. On one side, the panel. On the other, a single chair. Adversarial symmetry. She entered without escort. Her boots struck the floor in steady intervals, the sound contained by the architecture. The door sealed behind her with a soft hydraulic hush, sealing the room into isolation. Her ID badge rested flat against her uniform, its edges still scratched from field use. Under recessed lighting, it reflected a faint glow, not polished enough to shine, not dull enough to disappear. She took her seat. Across the table, 5 officers sat in calibrated alignment. Their uniforms were pressed into sharp planes. Their ID badges lay centered against their chests, gleaming without abrasion. Before each of them stood a thin microphone, its red indicator light, dark for now. Folders were arranged in identical stacks. Tabs protruded with bureaucratic precision. The chair at the center of the panel leaned forward slightly. "Let the record show," he began, and the microphone's red indicator flickered on. "This is a formal review of operational conduct during the Viper Recon incident." The word incident settled in the air. Not rescue. Not correction. Incident. She folded her hands loosely on the table's edge. Her posture remained upright, neither rigid nor deferential. She did not adjust her badge. "Did you deploy underwritten orders?" The chair asked. "No." Her voice was level. It did not seek permission. A faint shifting of papers. "Did you have authorization?" "Yes." The recessed lighting above hummed faintly, a sterile echo of the operations center. The room felt smaller than it was, as though the walls themselves leaned inward to listen. A pause. "Verbal authorization," the chair clarified. "Yes." The microphone's red light glowed steadily now, recording not only words, but silence. Silence thickened between each exchange, stretching longer than necessary. It was not confusion. It was evaluation. Another panel member adjusted his glasses. "You deviated from rapid deployment rotation." "Yes." "You engaged without secondary confirmation of hostile count." "Yes." Each answer landed cleanly, unembellished. She did not elaborate. She did not defend. Across the table, one of the officers leaned back slightly, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "There are concerns," he said carefully, "that your engagement parameters were influenced by emotional assessment of the situation." The sentence was constructed with professional caution. It carried no overt accusation, only implication. Emotion. A familiar word. In the silence that followed, she remembered another room months earlier. A briefing, a suggestion that she might prefer support positioning given the intensity of direct overwatch. The implication, that composure, was gendered. That steadiness required proof. Here, the implication was subtler. Emotion as deviation. Emotion as instability. She met the speaker's gaze without challenge. My assessment was tactical, she said. Nothing more. The panel exchanged brief glances, not dramatic, not conspiratorial, simply calibrated. The long wooden table between them felt less like furniture and more like terrain. Lines of sight were calculated. Angles deliberate. Each microphone stood like a fixed weapon, its red indicator, a silent witness. You understand? The chair continued. That deviation from written protocol creates institutional exposure. Exposure, not vulnerability of personnel. Exposure of system. Guess, she said. And yet you proceeded. Guess. Another pause. On the table before the panel lay printed satellite images of the valley. Grainy overhead shots marked with coordinates and time. Her position on the ridge had been circled in red ink. The fallen hostiles marked with small, clinical X's. From this angle, the battlefield looked abstract, sanitized, reduced to symbols on paper. One of the officers tapped the image lightly. Rapid response was en route. 43 minutes out, she replied. The number did not need emphasis. The recessed lights cast narrow beams downward, illuminating her face while leaving her eyes partially shadowed. It was a subtle imbalance, visibility without full revelation. She did not shift beneath it. 43 minutes, the chair repeated, as if testing its shape. Silence followed. No one disputed the timeline. Instead, a different thread was pulled. Your silence overcomes, another panel member said. Why did you not respond to Viper Recon's direct address? A faint memory surfaced, the voiceover static. We see you. She held the memory without expression. Engagement required concentration, she said. And morale. She regarded him steadily. They required correction of hostile pressure. The room absorbed the statement without comment. No one mentioned that morale without survival was decorative. The microphone lights glowed red against polished wood. Her ID badge rested unmoving against her chest, neither swinging nor trembling. It marked her as belonging to the institution that now questioned her adherence to it. Belonging did not guarantee protection. You achieved tactical success? The chair acknowledged finally. The word success felt provisional. However, he continued, the panel must consider the precedent set by independent engagement. Precedent. There it was, the true axis of concern. If deviation saved lives once, it might justify deviation again. The system could not afford fluid boundaries. Boundaries preserved authority. She did not argue the point. Instead, she allowed silence to occupy the space between them. Silence, not as submission, but as refusal to validate the framing. The recessed lighting remained steady. The long wooden table did not tremble. The microphones continued to record. Do you believe, the chair asked at last, that you acted within the spirit of protocol? She did not look down at the satellite images. She did not glance at her badge. Yes, she said. No elaboration. The panel withdrew briefly for deliberation, leaving her alone at the table. The microphone's red light dimmed, extinguishing the record for a moment. In the sudden absence of that glow, the room felt emptier, less performative. She remained seated. Her posture did not change. The long wooden table stretched before her like a ridgeline. The reset's lighting cast its careful geometry. Her ID badge rested where it had always rested, against fabric worn thin at the edges. When the panel returned, their expressions were professionally neutral. The panel recognizes your effectiveness, the chair announced. A formal commendation will be entered into your record. A beat, a notation regarding procedural deviation will accompany it. Balance restored. Gratitude paired with caution. Recognition tempered with warning. She nodded once. Understood. No argument. No appeal. As she rose to leave, her badge caught the light briefly, flashing against the dark wood before settling back into matte restraint. The microphone's red indicator flickered off completely. The door opened with controlled softness. Beyond the chamber, corridors extended in clean lines, lit by the same recessed precision. The architecture of order remained intact. Inside the room, precedent had been contained. Outside, the institution continued forward. Unchanged. Institutions do not fear failure as much as they fear example. A failed mission can be mourned, archived, rationalized. A successful deviation threatens the blueprint itself. Saving lives within protocol preserves authority. Saving them outside it rewrites the rules. And rules, once rewritten, are harder to command than any battlefield.